On Tuesday, April 7th, 2026, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, Donald Trump opened his social media account and told 93 million Iranians in plain text that their civilization was probably going to end that night. Not in a classified briefing, not through a diplomatic back channel, in a public post addressed to the world. 6 hours later, he announced a ceasefire. And then, just when the world exhaled, Beirut exploded, hundreds of civilians killed. 1 million displaced people who had packed their bags to go home were told, the ceasefire does not apply to you. I'm Caitlin Collins. This is BBU News. Today we are taking you inside the most dramatic 24-hour sequence of this entire war, from the civilization threat to the ceasefire to the bombs that fell on Lebanon anyway. We will not skip a single detail. Stay with me. Good evening. Welcome to BBU News. I'm Caitlin Collins. Before we go any further, if you are watching us for the first time, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. We are covering this war every single day, and what is coming out of this region in the next 72 hours may be the most consequential news of this decade. Now, let me give you the framework for everything we are about to cover tonight. This story has 3 layers. The first layer is the 6-hour diplomatic crisis on April 7th, the civilization threat, the Pakistan back channel, and the ceasefire announcement. The second layer is what happened immediately after the ceasefire, when Israel launched its largest single-day strike on Lebanon in this entire war, killing hundreds of civilians who believed the fighting was over. The third layer is a ceasefire that is already fracturing, a Strait of Hormuz that is still not fully open, peace talks scheduled for Friday in Islamabad, and a region holding its breath. We are going to walk through all 3 layers, and clearly, completely, and without spin. Let's begin. Tuesday, April 7th did not begin quietly. Before dawn, U.S. and Israeli aircraft conducted what the Pentagon described as one of the most intensive strike packages of the entire campaign. Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal responsible for the vast majority of Iran's petroleum revenues, struck in overnight waves. Simultaneously, Israeli jets hit a facility in Shiraz involved in ballistic missile component production. Another missile site in northwestern Iran was struck in a separate coordinated wave. The message from Washington and Tel Aviv was clear: the deadline is real and the bombing will escalate dramatically if Iran does not comply. Iran, for its part, was not standing still. Drones and ballistic missiles continued flying outbound toward Israel, toward Saudi Arabia, toward Bahrain. The King Fahd Causeway caused the massive bridge linking Saudi Arabia and Bahrain across the Gulf was forced to close for the first time in its history due to active missile threat. Sirens activated across the UAE. Gulf states scrambled their air defenses. Israel's military posted warnings on social media telling Iranian civilians to stay away from railway lines, a signal that rail infrastructure was the next target category. The Strait of Hormuz remained closed to normal commercial traffic. Every hour it stayed shut, the global energy market convulsed further. Oil had climbed to $117 a barrel. Analysts were warning of $130, $140, $150 if the Strait remained blocked past the deadline. This was the backdrop: a war at full intensity, a deadline 6 hours away. And then at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Trump posted those words. The post read, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again." He added that he did not want that to happen, but that it probably would, that the world would find out that night, that it was one of the most important moments in the long and complex history of the world. The global reaction was immediate and severe. Former congressional leaders called it the most alarming public statement by an American president in living memory and called on Congress to reconvene and reassert its war powers authority. Senior international legal scholars stated publicly that threatening the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure, power plants, water treatment facilities, bridges serving civilian populations, constitutes a threat of collective punishment, which is prohibited under the 4th Geneva Convention, and that making such a threat publicly may itself constitute a violation of international humanitarian law. Pope Leo XIV, the first American-born pope in history, issued a rare direct statement calling the threat genuinely unacceptable and calling on people of goodwill everywhere to contact their political leaders and demand an immediate end to hostilities. More than 80 congressional Democrats were reported to be actively discussing 25th Amendment procedures, the constitutional mechanism allowing the vice president and a cabinet majority to remove a sitting president. In Tehran, the Iranian government responded in a way that no Western strategist had modeled. Officials called on ordinary citizens to form human chains around the country's power plants, to physically stand between their electrical infrastructure and the incoming strikes. Iranian state media broadcast footage of hundreds of Iranians gathering around power facilities, linking arms, standing in formation around the buildings that supply electricity to tens of millions of people. Iran's president posted that more than 14 million Iranians had registered to sacrifice their lives in defense of the country. Publicly, defiance. But privately, something very different was unfolding. The ceasefire was not born in Washington. It was not born in Tehran. It was born in Islamabad. For 48 hours before the deadline, Pakistan had been operating as the primary diplomatic conduit between two governments that had no direct communication and no established trust. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir, Pakistan's military, had been working both sides of this channel continuously through Monday night and all of Tuesday. At the moment of maximum tension on Tuesday afternoon, Prime Minister Sharif made a bold, very public move. He posted directly on social media, tagging President Trump, Vice President Vance, Secretary Rubio, Special Envoy Witkoff, and Iranian leadership simultaneously in the same message. His ask was precise and structured. He requested that Trump extend his deadline by 2 weeks. He asked Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz for 2 weeks as a goodwill gesture, and he asked all parties to observe a ceasefire across every active front for those same 2 weeks to create the space for a negotiated permanent resolution. This was not quiet diplomacy. This was public diplomacy at maximum visibility, so be on at the exact moment when every government on earth was watching. The White House responded carefully. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the president had been made aware of the proposal and that a response would come. 3 words: made aware, that told every analyst watching that the conversation inside the building had shifted. Simultaneously, and this is the part that has not received enough coverage, Iran moved. Through Pakistani intermediaries, Iran's Supreme National Security Council communicated readiness to accept the 2-week pause. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed that passage through the Strait of Hormuz could be facilitated through coordination with Iran's armed forces. This is a critical distinction. Iran was not surrendering control of the strait. Iran was offering to manage traffic through it on its own terms during the ceasefire window. Ships would move, but they would move on Iranian authorization. Simultaneously, Iran delivered to the United States a formal 10-point framework proposal for a comprehensive permanent end to the war. The proposal included coordinated strait passage, compensation for war damages, withdrawal of U.S. forces from regional bases, and full sanctions relief. Trump would later describe this proposal as workable. At 6:32 in the evening, 88 minutes before his own deadline expired, Donald Trump posted the ceasefire announcement. He credited Pakistan's Prime Minister and Field Marshal directly. He said Iran had agreed to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. He declared a 2-week suspension of U.S. bombing and attacks against Iran. He said the 10-point Iranian proposal was a workable basis for negotiation. He said almost all points of past contention had been agreed to. And then he wrote that it was an honor on behalf of the United States and representing the countries of the Middle East to have this long-term problem close to resolution. The world's financial markets responded within seconds. Oil prices dropped 8% in minutes from their earlier highs. Dow futures jumped 725 points. Japan's Nikkei soared more than 2,600 points overnight. South Korea's market jumped 6%. The Dow Jones itself would gain more than 1,300 points the following morning. In Tehran's Central Square, crowds gathered to celebrate not a military victory, but survival. The bombs that were supposed to fall that night did not fall. Pakistan announced the ceasefire effective immediately and invited both delegations to Islamabad for formal peace talks beginning Friday, April 10th. For approximately 6 hours on April 7, 2026, the fate of 93 million people, global energy markets, and the broader Middle East order had hung in genuine uncertainty. The civilization survived the night, but what came next shattered the relief almost immediately. Within hours of the ceasefire announcement, while displaced Lebanese families were literally packing their cars to drive home, Israel launched what its own military described as the largest coordinated strike on Lebanon since this war began. More than 100 targets, struck in under 10 minutes. Dense residential and commercial neighborhoods in central Beirut were hit without advance warning. Lebanese civil defense teams reported at least 254 people killed across the country on that single day. In Beirut alone, 92 civilians dead. 742 people wounded in a matter of minutes. Lebanon's health minister went before cameras and called it a dangerous escalation, urging international emergency assistance for a health system that was already overwhelmed. Now, here's the core political problem that made all of this worse. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif, the man who brokered the ceasefire, had publicly stated that the agreement applied to all fronts, including Lebanon. He said the U.S., Iran, and their allies had agreed to an immediate ceasefire everywhere. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu issued a statement saying Israel supported the U.S. decision to suspend strikes against Iran, and then added that the ceasefire does not include Lebanon. 2 directly contradictory statements, from the ceasefire's broker and from one of its key parties, published within hours of the agreement being announced. U.S. Vice President Vance, when pressed, criticized Iran's position, but also acknowledged that there had been a legitimate misunderstanding about Lebanon's inclusion in the deal. In other words, even inside the Trump administration, officials recognized that the ceasefire's terms were not clearly defined from the start. And that ambiguity, that gap between what Pakistan said and what Israel said, was already costing lives before the first day of the ceasefire had ended. The Lebanon strikes triggered an immediate chain reaction across the entire fragile ceasefire architecture. Hezbollah fired rockets into northern Israel in direct response, calling the strikes a grave violation of the agreement and warning that continued Israeli operations would destroy the entire deal. Iran escalated its diplomatic posture, threatening direct action against Israel if attacks on Lebanon did not stop immediately. Iran's parliament speaker called the ceasefire terms unreasonable, citing not only Lebanon but also a reported drone incursion into Iranian airspace and what Iran described as the denial of its right to uranium enrichment under any final agreement. And then came the economic blow that Wall Street had not priced in. Iranian media reported that oil tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had been halted again, just hours after the first vessels had been permitted to transit following the ceasefire. So, the reason cited, Israel's strikes on Lebanon. The Dow, which had surged over 1,000 points on ceasefire optimism, gave back a significant portion of those gains. Oil prices climbed back sharply. The brief window of global economic relief was closing. The IRGC Navy issued a statement that has received far too little attention in Western coverage. They stated plainly, the situation in the Strait of Hormuz will never return to what it was before the war, particularly for the United States and Israel. That is not a negotiating position. That is a declaration of permanent strategic change. Before we talk about what comes next, I want to give you the full human cost of what this 40-day war has already produced, because no ceasefire announcement and no Islamabad peace talk erases any of it. Inside Iran, more than 3,400 people killed, including over 1,600 civilians, more than 20,000 injured. Over 82,000 civilian structures damaged or destroyed. 18 hospitals struck. The Pasteur Institute, a century-old medical research center responsible for generations of Iranian vaccines, destroyed. Sharif University of Technology, Iran's equivalent of MIT, bomb. Inside Lebanon, more than 2,500 killed. Over 1.2 million people displaced, forced from their homes in just over 1 month, and now told that the ceasefire does not apply to them. Inside Israel, 23 killed. Residential buildings destroyed. Civilians killed in shelters by missiles that outpaced interception systems. American service members, 13 killed. More than 300 wounded. 6 soldiers lost in a single drone strike in Kuwait. These numbers are not statistics. They are the permanent record of what happens when diplomacy fails and military force becomes the primary language of international relations. So here's where the world stands as of today, April 8th, 2026. The ceasefire exists, but it is fracturing in real time. Missiles are still being reported in some areas. Israel is continuing operations in Lebanon under the position that Lebanon was never included in the deal. Hezbollah is firing back. Iran is threatening direct escalation. The Strait of Hormuz is partially closed again. Formal peace talks are scheduled to begin in Islamabad on Friday, April 10th. Vice President J.D. Vance is expected to lead the American delegation. Iran's 10-point proposal, which includes maximalist demands for compensation, troop withdrawal, and retained Iranian authority over the Strait, is on the table. The questions that will define the next 2 weeks are enormous. Does Iran actually deliver full, unrestricted passage through the Strait, or does it maintain supervisory control as a permanent strategic lever? Does Israel accept any framework that includes Lebanon? Do the IRGC commanders who have been making autonomous targeting decisions throughout this war actually stand down, or do they continue operations regardless of what political leaders sign in Islamabad? And does the Trump administration have the diplomatic capacity to hold together an agreement that its own closest ally is already undermining? 6 hours stood between a presidential threat to end a civilization and a ceasefire. Those 6 hours were carried almost entirely on the shoulders of Pakistan's prime minister and its military chief, serving as the human link between two governments that could not speak to each other directly. The civilization survived April 7th, but the war that brought us to that moment has left behind damage, physical, human, institutional, and geopolitical, that will take years, possibly decades, to fully understand. Subscribe right now, because the Islamabad talks begin in 48, and what comes out of that room will shape this region for a generation. And leave me a comment. Do you believe Iran came out of this 40-day war with more strategic leverage than it had before the bombing started? Or did the United States achieve its core objectives? I read every comment. I'm Caitlin Collins. This is BBU News. Good night.